Hello, I'm Kaylee Rose Evans. In this video I'm going to be interviewing Neil Carpenter. He's the author of Austerity's Victims. In the book it shows some of the real experiences of people living with a learning disability and who are affected by the austerity measures. Real statistics are used and examples of some of the difficult experiences people are going through and some of the things that just block their opportunities, and I think it's really thought-provoking and makes you feel angry, like you want things to change. It makes you feel a lot of emotions, and I think one of the things that it made me feel was that I was glad that Neil is an advocate for people, because I can't imagine you could get a better advocate. He's so kind and knowledgeable, and I think he has a lot of insight to share with other people in helping professions or people generally about the realities of the situation at the moment and how it has been and some of the changes that are needed in society to make it fairer for everyone living within it. So I hope you enjoy this video, and I'm going to be leaving information in the description box. So thank you. Thank you. So Neil and me together today just to talk about the book, Austerity's Victims. I've been totally blown away by how powerful some of the messages were in the book, and I think some of the personal stories that were shared, it really honed in on the struggles that people have gone through and like the real resilience as well of individuals. And I just wanted to start by asking you what made you want to write the book in the first place?
Well, there were a few reasons. First of all, when I started working as an advocate with people with a learning disability, after about 9 months or a year or so, it started to strike me that most of the people I was meeting seemed poor, and I couldn't see a logical reason why someone with a learning disability should almost necessarily be poor. And well, I wanted to see if my initial reaction was right, so I thought I'd take, well, as it turned out, 5 particular case studies, to see if I looked closely at the circumstances of these people, if it would in fact turn out that they were poor. I'll come on to this in just a moment. I mean, that was certainly the case. So that was one reason for writing the book as I did, with a focus on the case studies. I suppose the other reason was that I'd read a number of things which in almost every case I thought were excellent, but they would be just a little bit anecdotal. So they would talk, for example, in a chapter on the effect of austerity on a particular group of people. They might have half a page on a particular individual who was living in one part of the country, but you wouldn't actually get all the detail on that person's life and the sorts of things that person had just about enough money to spend to really get a convincing picture of what that person was like. And I've a couple of talks I've given, I've said, a skeptic could stand up and say, yeah, hang on a minute, you're saying this person's got no money left at the end of the month, but we don't know what they've blown it on earlier in the month.
Yeah.
Which would be completely unfair. But, so that was why I thought, well, if I take these detailed case studies, it's quite difficult for people to argue with the evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I thought it was powerful, the way that you showed the exact evidence of what is being spent and compared it to the average person. And I think it showed, I mean, you made quite a few like political points, didn't you, as well, and challenges to what was being put out. So do you want to speak a bit about that side of things?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, as far as the political challenges were concerned, yes, I did, but equally, I didn't want to rant and rave.
Yeah.
Because I think if you rant and rave, you put a lot of readers off. If they think, well, you've just got a political purpose here, and you're looking for the evidence to fit what you want to say. But yes, I mean, in particular, in the final 2 chapters, I focus on how different experience on the ground is from what politicians say. Either they think it is or they pretend it is.
Yeah.
And for example, on employment, when there are easy statistics given about the number of people with a disability or with a learning disability who are getting into employment, all looks very reassuring. There is nothing reassuring about the employment pattern of the 5 people in particular in my book. You get a similar point that comes out about benefits, where the line which the politicians will often take is, if, for example, people have a bad experience going through the benefits process, they will say, well, what we're trying to do is to make sure that the people most in need get the benefits. Well, that's like a downward spiral, if you like. If you've always got to be the person who is most in need, if you keep going and going and going, by the end there's only going to be one person who's going to get a benefit. Because you can always say, well, this person is worse off than that person. And one of the things that I felt very strongly about was that if you, in one of the case studies in particular, the case study of Danny, he is, you probably remember, is someone who had a horrendous motorbike accident in 1980 and who had to rebuild his whole life, basically. Had to learn how to crawl again, absolutely everything. And it was a process of years before he could get back. He could get to the point where he could live independently, with help from his family, but he was nonetheless in his own flat, and he could go to a day centre and work there, not full days all the time, but and that created for him, a life which he felt was valuable. And then in 2016, the DWP carry out a work capability assessment on him, decide that he's fit for work, and take his employment and support allowance away from him, which, just to clarify the figures, I mean, he had approximately, his total income from employment and support allowance and disability living allowance was about £160 altogether. Taking the employment and support allowance away from him took 115 away. So he was therefore left with approximately £45 a week on which to exist.
Yeah, it's just impossible. And I think as a social worker, I often see this happening. And I think a lot of people see the frustrations of it, because it just seems like complete injustice, because it creates inconsistency in people's lives, doesn't it? Like you were saying, people need consistent support to function and be independent and manage. And sometimes it can make it worse, can't it?
Yeah.
When it's given.
So sorry, you carry on.
No, that's it. That's all I was going to say.
No, but you're absolutely right. And then, I think the way the benefits process is treating people is, in one sense, different from austerity, or it's a different facet of austerity. But another facet of it is the way that the way that councils have been starved of money, and you must be aware of that, I would think. Yeah. In every respect in what you do. It means, for example, with the Care Act of 2014, you've got, you know more about it than I do, but you might have, you've got a statement there about which sets well-being at the core of any arrangements that are made, and the way in which that well-being is broken down into its components. I mean, you might want to argue a little bit with one or two things of it, but to me, it's a very good definition. Mm-hmm. The problem arises that councils don't have the money to actually meet the commitments they have under the Care Act. Yeah. And so, again, the gap between what politicians would like to delude people is going on, and what actually is going on is huge.
And it is that gap that is that what is discussed and brought forward with the examples in the book, really, about how it is far from people having well-being and dignity. And I'm just thinking about some of the views that we were discussing around people enjoying and having a good quality of life as opposed to just survival, because I felt that was a key part of the book as well.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there. One of the measures of income, if you like, that I take is the minimum income standard of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which it's when you hear the term minimum income, it sounds as though it's just going to be the absolute bare minimum that you need to get by, and it's not. It's more than that. It's the income you need to, if you like, be a participating member of society. But even taking that definition, the income of the people in the book falls well below that. So on any measure you like to take, be it the minimum income standard or relative poverty, they are below that. And then, of course, if you simply don't have the money, you cannot participate. There's a section when I look at what the key people in the case studies, what they actually do socially. And all right, you've got two of them who go into a day centre, and the other three who get support at home. Now that, of course, is social contact, and I'm not demeaning it at all, because it's invaluable for all of them. But if you then look at other social contact, the one man called Frank, obviously any of my comments don't apply in the COVID period, but if you go back to before COVID, once a week he might go into a pub, Wetherspoons, whatever it was, and have half a pint of bitter on his own. Another man, Les, will have his lunch out at the weekend, but again, that is on his own. It is so rare for them to have, the sort of social contact that, that the majority of us, take for granted. Yeah. And so obviously you've then got the problem of loneliness that sets in the wake of all that.
Yeah, and I think that was highlighted by how people went to day centres and then certain things are closed, aren't they? And then people can't enjoy the things that they did and where all the friends were and things.
That's right. I mean, because you're dead right. Because as far as COVID is concerned, I mean, that obviously has made things a lot worse. And it's quite interesting when I think because of issues that relate to the vaccination program, the vaccination rollout, learning disabilities has gone up the agenda a little bit more. I think people are a little bit more aware of it than they were before. But in everything that I've seen, that there's been virtually no mention of the role of day centres and the impact that has had on people who, as you say, are dependent on them, for that social contact. There's someone I've seen over this last year who formerly went to a day centre 2 days a week. Now that, combined with support at home, gave a structure to his week.
Yeah.
The moment you pull the day centre out of it, particularly as the agency giving him support, and it wasn't their fault. They had had staff self-isolating and so on. So the structure coming from them was not last April and May absolutely consistent all the time. Then the person on the receiving end of it just feels a bit lost.
Yeah. I've seen examples of that have been heartbreaking over this time. I've been involved with people where I've tried to think about, the well-being principle, and implement it, but sort of pulling things together so that I can think of a lady that needed to go into a care home but lived with her son, and they've lived together sort of dependent on each other, and then unfortunately she was losing some of her memory, and that was like a big problem, but he was actually able to visit and have his lunch with his mum, and I just thought it was lovely because it was like they were still supported to do that, and he enjoyed going in, and it kept that sense of like relationship between them. But then obviously because of the pandemic that's not been possible, and he also can't go to the day centres, which he does every day, and I think it's just when you hear the real examples that's when you understand like the nature of these problems. And I think that the use of the case studies within this book really made me understand a lot of the things that a lot more deeply than I would have done before.
Well, I don't know if you remember this detail from the book, but one of the men, Thomas, whose family are exceptionally supportive, that they wanted to make sure that the flat that he moved into, he's a man with Down syndrome, they wanted to make sure that he moved somewhere where he had decent furniture, as they put it. And when I go around there, I mean, it's very well equipped. But they contrasted that with the flat next door, where when the man moved in, he had a television, but the television was resting on a cardboard box, and that was all that could be managed. And it's just absolutely appalling when people have to live in that way. And I think one of my concerns in writing the book was that these, I forget. I should be able to remember. I forget the title I used for the first chapter about Frank. It's something like The Quiet Man Next Door. That there are one or two people, one or two of the case studies who would certainly not be quiet men next door. There is one who, you probably describe as a bit of a Jack the Lad. The other one, Les, in his early 60s it was then, who, in his opinions, very aggressive. So anyone living next door to him would always know that he was there. But there's quite a lot of people in the quiet, just tucked away category that nobody ever knows about. And
and I don't know if this is, obviously as a social worker, I see certain things that I do feel like there's a very tight line of people who actually get support within learning disability that are actually classed as people who would get support from that. And like there seems to be a lot of people that fall outside of it that are the ones that sometimes suffer as well.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think, well, I remember when I started as a volunteer, I was looking for example, if I went into a day centre or that would be the obvious instance. I was looking for someone there to explain to me. I'm not obsessed with categories, but almost just to know, well, that person I've just been talking to, what learning difficulty does he have? And on lots of occasions that they'd look at me a bit blankly, and it wasn't that they didn't know, but it wasn't an issue that particularly mattered to them. And I'm not suggesting they were casual, quite the opposite. I think it was instead that they were actually responding to the need that was there. But then the system as a whole does want to put people into categories. And but for example, in the benefits process, I mean, there are certain conditions which will, I'm sure, on the DWP system flag someone up as someone who's probably going to need the benefit. But last year I dealt with a tribunal case for someone who had global developmental delay. Now, my ignorance, I hadn't heard of it before, and I suspect it didn't raise the right flag for him at the DWP.
Yeah.
And so, you know, with their categories, he just slipped through the net.
Yeah, I have a problem with that. I think because it is, people do slip through in it, and if you don't say the right things on the day, you highlighted that in the book, didn't you, about how someone presented quite well on one day, but it's not reflective of how they actually are on a different day, and then they don't get the benefits that they so desperately need.
Oh, and absolutely. I mean, you've probably seen, you know, the sort of form which someone has to fill in for PIP, but it's 33 pages long. But one of the things that, you know, always strikes me with it, once you've covered the bare factual detail at the start, for example, your date of birth and all the information like that, you then have 12 sections altogether, and on the left you will have boxes that can be ticked, and then you have a blank page on the right which is for you to put additional information down. Well, the mistake which a lot of people make, which is understandable because the form's so intimidating, is just to think, well, I'll tick these boxes, yes, that's true for me, and the boxes are forcing you into yes or no choices about a particular thing you can do. Well, the reality for most people is that, you know, that strict binary division, you know, doesn't reflect their life. You know, I also you want the grey areas in there. You really want to explain, well, yeah, on this day I can do that, but then if my energy levels are low, I can't, and then
that's true. And then we're meant to take a strengths-based approach, aren't we? So people think, what are people's strengths? But then in order to get certain things, you have to emphasize your weaknesses. So it's all very confusing, isn't it?
Well, you're dead right. It's worse than confusing. I mean, I unless it's handled carefully, it can be really demoralizing for the person concerned, because, you know, if assuming that you can't assume that they've got family background, but in most cases, or in a lot of cases, they would have support from, you know, support workers or day centre. And what those people will have been doing is building the person up all the time, you know, to give them confidence that they can do things. And then if I come in at a stage, say, where, you know, they've been turned down, and we've got to work through the mandatory reconsideration process or the tribunal or whatever. After we've had a chat for half an hour, I say, look, I've got to apologise for this, because I know there are loads of things that you do really well, but just for this, we're going to have to look at the things that you struggle with. And you know, it's a nasty old process, really.
Yeah, it definitely is. I'm just sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you see, because with that, I mean, since I wrote the book, the majority of my work has been benefits related. You know, with a lot of tribunals, which thankfully have all been successful, and, you know, I take a little bit of credit there, but most of the credit, if that's not the wrong word to use, goes to the fact that the original decision was so obviously wrong. You know, you see such crass injustice perpetrated, and the physical tribunals that I've gone to, there was one that was done on the phone during the COVID period, and that was an experience. But the physical ones I've gone to, it has been a relief to actually get in front of an independent panel, a judge, and, you know, it's often a retired GP and SEN disability specialist, get people who are independent of the DWP, and suddenly all the confident negative judgments that were made by the DWP get overturned.
That must be a good feeling when you just think this is actually being seen for what it is, and people with real insight into what people's needs are as well.
Yes, that's right.
And who want to listen to the facts as well, because so yeah, I think
you have one instance where I've mentioned this a couple of talks I've given. The man with Down syndrome I already mentioned, who's one of the case studies there, and it's another point. I would like to stress how it's quite easy, perhaps, to think of the book as just rooted in a particular time period. So it was published in 2018, for example. So people might be tempted to think, right, okay, yeah, well, that was then. But the now is every bit the same, and it's probably worse. And as an example of that, Thomas, one of the men in the book, after the book is published, he has, in employment and support allowance, you have two different levels. He was moved from the higher level to the lower level. We took that change to a tribunal, and what I always do is prepare a full written submission that goes in advance, so that the judge and all the rest of it can see the line that we're taking. And we got in, and we didn't have to present any oral evidence. We said we've looked at it just introduced the panel to us, said thank you very much, you've won your case, and we didn't have to say anything. Now that, to me, highlights the gulf between what the DWP is doing and what a judge sitting independently would arrive at as a decision.
Yeah. I think I just wanted to finish with that point that we were discussing prior to this, around views about people's value being rooted in their ability to work.
Yeah.
So could you just discuss a bit about your views on that?
Yes, certainly could. Well, I think a lot of the discussion in our society, and this doesn't just relate to disability or learning disability, assumes that people's value comes from work that they do, for which they are paid, and therefore at the end of that process they are seen as having economic or financial value. When I think there are a lot of people for whom that doesn't apply, and certainly a lot of the people in my book that is true of. Their opportunity to work has declined. Well, in one or two cases, it's barely got off the ground, to be honest, at certain points. But they will work in different ways. So the one man who had his employment and support allowance taken away after a work capability assessment, he works just in a day centre, and he's not paid for it. But that really gives value to his existence, because, well, he has obviously the company of the people at the day centre. He has responsibility for a particular polytunnel. What he produces in the polytunnel is part of what the day centre then sells to, again, in normal non-COVID times, to restaurants and cafes in the area. So he has for himself the feeling of identity and the feeling of worth that comes from work, but without the money.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't, well, first of all, I don't think we should judge people by money, but equally there are one or two other people whose ability to work is is limited, and even if it is limited, the amount of work they do has to be valued, because from that, any number of other things common sense really, but a lot of things that are mentioned in the Care Act about dignity, self-esteem, and all the rest of it, they stem from that. Whereas if you don't feel valued, if you haven't got the company and so on, then you're not going to.
Yeah, definitely. And it just reminds me of what a good friend of mine called Jerry says about that everyone deserves respect and acceptance. And I think it is coming down to those simpler things, like and like at a basic human level, like we should respect other people and everyone's intrinsically valuable.
Yeah.
And I sometimes just think that we do look at people's value from all of these other things that, and I think sometimes when you are supporting people and you are like looking in people's eyes and like really seeing who they are, like that's when you realize what's important.
Yeah.
And it's a privilege really to support people, isn't it, and meet different people.
Well, you took the word out of my mouth. It is a privilege. I mean, I feel I'm learning all the time, and having to challenge my own assumptions all the time, and some of the ways are quite cliched. Where you see someone able to do something that in a million years I couldn't do.
Yeah.
And yet, that person, coming back to the old category idea, is seen as a lesser being than me. And I mean, that is just nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I even started doing this to start in the beginning was because I was supporting someone where they had a lot of barriers against them, and seeing what they achieved by the resources they had available, free from YouTube and stuff, just inspired me so much. And I just thought, it changes you if you really think about it. So
yeah. Well, your enthusiasm really comes across.
Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah. I'm just going to keep doing this for years. That's my plan, and just keep building stuff up. So
yeah. No, well, I'm sure you will, Kaylee.